But the truth of the matter is, I really don't know. And the truth of the matter is, it's probably genetic. And the truth of the matter is, I'm in violation of many of your laws.
What if I told you that one of the most beloved science fiction films of all time, a movie often cited as the greatest entry in the entire Star Trek franchise, carried with it a truth that William Shatner himself kept hidden for decades? At 94 years old, the man who brought Captain James T. Kirk to life has finally begun speaking openly about what really happened during the making of Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan. And the truth is not what fans imagined. For years, audiences believed the movie's magic came from the sheer brilliance of its script, its memorable villain, and Shatner's commanding presence. But what if the real story was one of doubt, conflict, and fragile trust between cast, crew, and studio? What if Shatner, behind his legendary confidence, was battling fears that the film might spell the end of his career rather than its crowning moment? The Wrath of Khan is remembered for its iconic showdown with Ricardo Montalban's Khan, for its themes of aging, sacrifice, and legacy, and for Spock's heartbreaking final words, "The needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few, or the one." But hidden beneath that cinematic triumph was a secret Shatner rarely addressed in public: how close the production came to collapse and how deeply personal the movie became for him at a time when his own life felt uncertain. At 94, Shatner has finally broken that silence. His truth is both tender and haunting. It forces us to rethink not only the film itself, but also the man who stood at its center, wrestling with age, mortality, and the fear of being replaced. So, let's go back. Long before he put on that gold Starfleet uniform, before the debates over who was the better captain, before the rivalries and reconciliations, there was a boy from Montreal with a restless imagination. And his story, as much as Khan's, shaped what Wrath of Khan became. Because here's the part no one knew. William Shatner's truth about Star Trek II begins not in Hollywood, not on the bridge of the Enterprise, but in the shadows of his childhood. William Shatner was born in Montreal, Quebec on March 22, 1931. The world he entered was precarious. The Great Depression was still casting its long shadow across North America, and his family, Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe, understood hardship and resilience intimately. His father, Joseph, ran a small men's clothing business. His mother, Anne, filled the home with warmth, but also instilled in her children a drive for survival and success. Young Bill, as he was known then, was curious, energetic, and often restless. He wasn't content to simply observe life. He wanted to inhabit it, to perform it, to command attention even before he truly understood what performance meant. Neighborhood friends remembered him as the boy who never seemed to tire of telling stories or acting out adventures. But behind that boyhood bravado was something else, an acute awareness of fragility. Shatner's family, though stable, was not wealthy. He often felt the precariousness of life pressing in. Later in interviews, he would admit that fear of failure haunted him from the start, as if every opportunity might be his last. This fear, ironically, became the fuel for his determination. When he first discovered acting, it was almost accidental. At summer camp, he was asked to participate in amateur performances. Something clicked instantly. Acting wasn't just fun, it was liberating. It allowed him to channel his restless energy, to slip into another skin, to be someone larger, bolder, untouchable. That sensation would never leave him. By the time he attended McGill University, Shatner had already set his sights on the stage. He studied economics, perhaps out of practicality, but his heart belonged to performance. He became involved in the Montreal Repertory Theatre, honing his craft, pushing himself to command attention in front of an audience. And though few could have predicted it then, those early performances contained the seeds of the Captain Kirk persona, the commanding voice, the dramatic pauses, the unwavering certainty, even when he himself was unsure. But here's where it gets complicated. Shatner's confidence on stage masked deep insecurities off stage. Even as he gained recognition in Canadian theater, he worried constantly about being forgotten, about opportunities slipping away. He worked relentlessly, often taking roles others turned down, simply to keep moving forward. That hunger, that refusal to stop, would become both his greatest strength and his greatest burden. By the mid-1950s, Shatner had crossed the border into the United States, chasing bigger dreams. He performed at the Stratford Shakespeare Festival in Ontario, where critics began to notice his talent. Soon after, he transitioned to television roles in New York, appearing in live dramas that tested every ounce of his ability. These early experiences, filled with the chaos of live performance, taught him improvisation, resilience, and above all, presence. He didn't just want to play a role, he wanted to own it. And when Hollywood finally called, Shatner was ready to leap. Yet it wasn't destiny that made him Captain Kirk. It was a winding path of bit parts, near misses, and constant hustle. Before Star Trek ever aired in 1966, Shatner had already faced disappointment and rejection. Roles slipped through his fingers. Critics sometimes dismissed him as too theatrical. He lived at times, hand to mouth, doing whatever he could to stay afloat. These struggles mattered because they shaped how he approached both Star Trek and, later, The Wrath of Khan. Beneath the iconic swagger was a man terrified of irrelevance. Every role felt like it might be his last chance. Every project a test he couldn't afford to fail. As a child, he had feared instability. As a young actor, he lived it. By the time Gene Roddenberry approached him to play the captain of the Starship Enterprise, Shatner was ready not only to accept the role but to seize it with both hands. Kirk wasn't just another part. It was survival. And yet, that very hunger would also plant the seeds of rivalry, friction, and eventual revelation. Because the truth Shatner would only admit at 94 is this. Wrath of Khan wasn't simply a movie about Kirk facing an old enemy. It was Shatner, once again, fighting his own fear of being forgotten. Now, if you're wondering how that fear collided with one of the greatest science fiction films ever made, the story only deepens. To understand it, we must trace Shatner's rise to fame, the moment when the boy from Montreal finally stepped onto the bridge of the Enterprise and into cultural immortality. And that's when everything changed. When William Shatner first stepped onto the set of Star Trek in 1966, there was no way to know he was about to inhabit one of the most enduring roles in television history. At that point, Shatner was simply another working actor in Hollywood. Talented, yes, but hardly a household name. He had played supporting roles on The Twilight Zone, Alfred Hitchcock Presents, and countless anthology dramas. He had appeared in movies, often as the secondary character. But nothing had yet given him the cultural immortality he craved. Enter Gene Roddenberry. A former LAPD officer turned television writer, Roddenberry dreamed of a spacefaring adventure series that was part Western, part morality play, and part reflection of contemporary politics. He pitched Star Trek as Wagon Train to the Stars. It needed a central figure, someone commanding, charismatic, and utterly believable as the captain of a futuristic starship. Roddenberry had already shot a pilot starring Jeffrey Hunter as Captain Christopher Pike. NBC rejected it. For the second pilot, Roddenberry wanted something different. He found his answer in Shatner. From the first screen test, it was clear Shatner had something electric. He projected authority even when he was improvising. His voice carried conviction. His physicality made him believable as a man who could lead others into the unknown. Roddenberry reshaped the captain into James T. Kirk, and Shatner threw himself into the role with a kind of hungry determination. But here's where it gets complicated. While Kirk quickly became a symbol of decisiveness and courage on screen, Shatner's own life was filled with insecurity. He worried constantly about whether the show would last, whether he would ever escape the uncertainty that had defined his early years. Behind that golden Starfleet tunic was an actor fighting to hold on to stability. The first season of Star Trek was rocky, ratings were modest. NBC executives doubted the show's future. The production was expensive, the stories sometimes too cerebral for network television, yet Shatner's performance stood out. Viewers responded to him, not just as a leader but as a human being. Kirk was brave, but also flawed. He made mistakes, wrestled with moral dilemmas, and bore the weight of command. Shatner gave him dimension, even when the scripts leaned toward pulp. Then came the chemistry that no one could have predicted. Shatner's Kirk paired with Leonard Nimoy's Spock. Their on-screen dynamic, passionate humanity balanced by cold logic, became the beating heart of Star Trek. And though the actors sometimes clashed off camera, together they created one of the greatest friendships in science fiction history. Despite this magic, NBC canceled Star Trek after 3 seasons in 1969. At the time, it seemed like just another failed show. Shatner's career took a sharp downturn. He had gone from starship captain to struggling actor in a matter of months. He picked up guest spots on TV shows, performed in regional theater, and even lived in a camper with his children after his marriage ended, because money was scarce. For Shatner, it was a humbling reminder of how fleeting fame could be. He later described this period as one of the lowest points in his life. Yet it also reinforced the lesson that had driven him since childhood. Survival depended on persistence. Meanwhile, something unexpected was happening in the culture at large. Reruns of Star Trek began airing in syndication during the 1970s. New generations discovered the show. Fan clubs sprang up. Conventions appeared. The show NBC had canceled was quietly becoming a phenomenon. And at the center of that renewed interest was Shatner, forever tethered to Captain Kirk. But this revival came with its own paradox. Fans adored him, but Hollywood still saw him as typecast. Offers for leading roles were scarce. He worried he might be trapped forever as Kirk, unable to escape the shadow of the Enterprise. Then came the turning point. Paramount Pictures, realizing the cultural power of the Star Trek fan base, decided to capitalize on it. In 1979, after years of rumors and delays, Star Trek, the motion picture, hit theaters. Shatner reprised his role as Kirk, now an admiral struggling to adapt to a desk job while yearning for the captain's chair once more. On paper, it was the triumphant return of a franchise. In reality, the movie was bloated, slow, and overstuffed with special effects. While it made money, critics panned it. Fans were divided. Shatner himself later admitted he worried the film's failure might end Star Trek forever. And here's the kicker. The lukewarm reception of the motion picture set the stage for the wrath of Khan. Paramount executives knew they couldn't afford another misstep. They brought in Nicholas Meyer, a young director with little attachment to the franchise, to inject energy and urgency. Meyer envisioned something leaner, sharper, and more emotional, a film that would strip away the excess and return to the spirit of adventure. For Shatner, this meant something terrifying. His legacy as Captain Kirk was on the line. If the Wrath of Khan failed, it could bury not only Star Trek, but also his career. At nearly 50 years old, Shatner feared he might not get another chance. And yet, that very pressure created something extraordinary. Shatner approached the film with intensity, channeling his fears into Kirk's own journey. In the movie, Kirk wrestles with aging, irrelevance, and the specter of death. He confronts Khan, yes, but more importantly, he confronts himself. It was Shatner's truth bleeding into Kirk's story. But here's where it gets complicated again. Behind the scenes, tensions simmered. Shatner worried about being overshadowed by Ricardo Montalban's performance as Khan. He worried about Leonard Nimoy's Spock stealing the spotlight, especially since Nimoy had asked to be killed off. And he worried about the script itself, which forced Kirk to face vulnerability in a way Shatner wasn't accustomed to playing. The stage was set for one of the most iconic science fiction films ever made. Yet, as Shatner now admits at 94, he never felt secure during its making. He feared disaster at every turn, and that's when everything changed. Because Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan would not only redeem the franchise, it would expose Shatner's deepest insecurities and force him to face truths he had avoided for decades. When audiences think of Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan, they remember the brilliance of Ricardo Montalban's Khan, the emotional weight of Spock's sacrifice, and the resurgence of the franchise. What they don't see are the hidden struggles William Shatner endured during its making. Conflicts that shook his confidence and rivalries that nearly unraveled the story behind the scenes. By the time cameras rolled in 1981, Shatner was no longer the young leading man he once had been. He was approaching 50, a fact that weighed heavily on him. Hollywood was unforgiving to actors who aged out of their prime, especially those who had become closely identified with a single role. Shatner worried that audiences would look at Kirk and see not a daring space captain, but an aging relic. The script itself cut close to the bone. Nicholas Meyer wanted Wrath of Khan to explore themes of mortality, aging, and legacy. Kirk's storyline, grappling with his birthday, feeling sidelined, and realizing he had never truly faced death, echoed Shatner's private fears. It was art imitating life, but for Shatner it felt uncomfortably personal. And then there was Ricardo Montalban, cast as Khan Noonien Singh, reprising his role from the 1967 television episode Space Seed. Montalban threw himself into the part with operatic energy. His voice thundered, his presence commanded, and his charisma threatened to overshadow everyone else. Shatner noticed. He admired Montalban's performance, but he also worried. Would this movie, meant to re-establish Kirk's legacy, be remembered instead for its villain? Behind closed doors, Shatner wrestled with that question. He scrutinized his own lines, pushed for changes, and sometimes clashed with Meyer over how Kirk should be portrayed. Shatner wanted to maintain Kirk's authority, while Meyer was more interested in exposing his vulnerabilities. Let him show weakness, Meyer argued. That's where the drama lies. For Shatner, weakness was terrifying. It echoed his deepest insecurities about being forgotten. Then came the tension with Leonard Nimoy. Their relationship had always been complicated. On screen, Kirk and Spock embodied one of television's greatest friendships. Off-screen, the two men respected each other, but rivalry simmered. Nimoy was often praised for his subtle, layered performances, while critics mocked Shatner's theatrical style. Nimoy had also become a beloved figure among fans, perhaps even more so than Shatner. When Nimoy requested that Spock die in Wrath of Khan, it sent shockwaves through the production. Fans didn't know it at the time, but Nimoy had grown weary of being defined by Spock. He wanted closure. Shatner was rattled. If Spock died, would Nimoy's performance dominate the film's emotional core? Would Kirk fade into the background in his own story? Filming Spock's death scene only intensified those fears. The sequence inside the radiation chamber remains one of the most iconic moments in cinematic history. Kirk and Spock's hands pressed against glass. The quiet exchange of words, "I have been and always shall be your friend." Audiences wept. But for Shatner, behind the camera, the scene carried a different weight. He later admitted that he felt overshadowed by Nimoy's gravitas. Watching his co-star steal the emotional climax stirred an old fear that Kirk would be remembered as secondary in the franchise he had carried for years. And yet, Shatner couldn't deny the brilliance of the moment. It was painful, but it was undeniable. That tension, admiration mixed with envy, defined his hidden struggle throughout the film. Money added another layer of conflict. Shatner's contract, dating back to the original series, guaranteed him parity with Nimoy in pay and billing. But he worried constantly about being edged out, about losing his negotiating power if the studio decided Nimoy was more essential. Hollywood was a business first, art second. Shatner, ever conscious of survival, knew that better than anyone. Outside the set, his personal life was no less tumultuous. His second marriage had collapsed, leaving him with financial and emotional strain. He had children to support, debts to manage, and a career still balancing on uncertainty. At night, away from the cameras, Shatner felt the weight of it all pressing down. Was this the price of fame? Or something deeper, a reminder that every success carried shadows just out of view? Even during the lighter moments, conflict lingered. Stories circulated about Shatner's competitiveness on set, how he sometimes monopolized the camera or fought for more lines. Co-stars rolled their eyes, fans whispered about ego, but underneath was that same fragile truth. He couldn't afford to fade. For Shatner, every scene was a battle for relevance. And here's the irony. That very struggle fueled the film's authenticity. Kirk's fear of aging, of being left behind, of confronting death. Those weren't just scripted words. They were Shatner's reality, bleeding into the performance. When Kirk growls, "I don't like to lose," he wasn't just speaking as a character. He was voicing Shatner's own creed. The press never saw this side of him. To the public, Shatner was the confident captain, leading the Enterprise with certainty. But in private, during the long days of filming, he wrestled with doubts he never admitted until decades later. At 94, when asked about Wrath of Khan, he finally revealed that making the film was one of the most emotionally grueling experiences of his career. It wasn't just another job, it was a reckoning. And then came the moment that crystallized it all, watching the rough cut of the film. Shatner sat in the screening room, nervous, skeptical, bracing for disappointment. As the story unfolded, as Kirk faced his old nemesis and as Spock sacrificed himself, Shatner felt something shift. For the first time, he realized the film wasn't about losing relevance. It was about finding meaning in vulnerability. Kirk's struggle mirrored his own, but instead of diminishing him, it gave him depth. Still, the struggle didn't end with that revelation. Shatner carried the weight of the film's success anxiously. Would audiences embrace it? Would critics sneer? When Wrath of Khan premiered in 1982, the response stunned him. Fans hailed it as a masterpiece. Critics called it a redemption for the franchise. And for Shatner, the relief was overwhelming. Yet even in victory, shadows lingered. Nimoy's performance as Spock became the emotional anchor of the film. Montalban's Khan was immortalized as one of the greatest villains in science fiction. Shatner, though central, sometimes felt eclipsed by those around him. He smiled for the cameras, gave interviews, and played the role of the triumphant star. But privately, he still wrestled with the same old question: had he done enough? Now, if you're wondering why Shatner waited until his 90s to finally admit these truths, the answer lies in what came next. The years after Wrath of Khan brought more films, more triumphs, and more pain. And through it all, the weight of that one film never left him. Because here's the part no one knew. For Shatner, the Wrath of Khan wasn't just a cinematic comeback, it was a mirror. And in that mirror, he saw a man both victorious and afraid, immortalized and insecure. And that's when everything changed. At 94 years old, William Shatner sits in the rare position of being both a cultural icon and a man unburdened by the need to protect his image. The bravado that once shielded him, the carefully cultivated aura of Captain Kirk, no longer matters in the same way. He has lived long enough to outlast critics, rivals, and the relentless passage of time. And with that longevity comes a kind of freedom, the freedom to finally tell the truth. For decades, when fans asked about the Wrath of Khan, Shatner offered the standard stories. How Ricardo Montalban's chest really was his own, not a prosthetic. how Leonard Nimoy insisted on Spock's death, how Nicholas Meyer saved the film from becoming another lumbering disappointment like the motion picture. These were anecdotes, entertaining, but safe. What he rarely admitted, until now, was the deeper truth about what the film meant to him personally. At 94, he finally put words to it. Wrath of Khan was not just about Kirk facing mortality, it was about Shatner himself. He confessed that during the filming he was terrified of aging, terrified of being replaced, terrified that his career had peaked and that everything afterward would be decline. When Kirk looked into the void and asked, "How we deal with death is at least as important as how we deal with life," those words resonated more deeply than audiences ever knew. Shatner wasn't just delivering lines, he was trying to convince himself. The rivalry with Nimoy, once cloaked in polite smiles and carefully chosen words, also became part of the truth. Shatner admitted that he envied Nimoy's gravitas, his fan base, his ability to capture the emotional heart of the franchise. In Wrath of Khan, when Spock dies and Kirk grieves, Shatner felt overshadowed. "It was Leonard's moment," he has since said, "and I struggled with that. I wanted it to be mine." But age has softened his view. Looking back, Shatner now sees the brilliance of that scene not as a threat, but as a gift. It immortalized both men. Spock's death only works because Kirk is there to feel it, to break down, to show the humanity audiences had rarely seen in him before. The rivalry, Shatner admits, blinded him at the time. But with distance, he can acknowledge that Nimoy's strength gave him permission to show weakness, and in that vulnerability lay the film's true power. The other part of Shatner's long-held silence was his fear of being forgotten. He admitted that even as audiences embraced Wrath of Khan, he couldn't enjoy the success fully. "I always thought it could vanish tomorrow," he explained in one interview late in life. "One bad movie, one poor decision, and you're gone." That fear never left me. Only now, with a legacy secured beyond question, can he finally confess how fragile he felt during that time. And then came the most haunting revelation of all. Shatner confessed that the death of Spock on screen mirrored something he had been unwilling to face in his own life, the inevitability of losing people he loved. By the early 1980s, he had already endured divorce, financial struggles, and the disintegration of friendships. Watching Nimoy's Spock die forced him to confront the inevitability of death itself, not just for his character but for himself. "We were playing at immortality," Shatner reflected, "but the truth was always there. None of us are immortal. And that terrified me." For years, he buried those feelings under humor, bravado, and endless work. He wrote books, recorded albums, took on roles big and small. He kept moving, as he had since childhood, afraid that if he stopped, the fear would consume him. But at 94, he has learned that the truth, his truth, is that the Wrath of Khan became his mirror. It reflected back every insecurity, every fear, every doubt he carried. And instead of destroying him, it gave him a story that still resonates more than 40 years later. "People talk about Kirk cheating death," Shatner has said. "But the truth is, the film showed me I couldn't cheat it. None of us can. And admitting that was the hardest part." For fans, the revelation reframes the film. What we once saw as a thrilling space adventure becomes something deeper, a confession in disguise. Kirk's fear of irrelevance was Shatner's. Kirk's reckoning with mortality was Shatner's. And Spock's death was not just a plot twist. It was the embodiment of Shatner's unspoken fear of loss. And here's where the story bends toward poignancy. At 94, Shatner no longer fears being forgotten. He knows he will always be remembered as Captain Kirk. But what he wants people to understand is that the triumph of Wrath of Khan wasn't born of confidence. It was born of doubt. The very insecurities he hid so fiercely were the ones that made Kirk's journey resonate. Now, if you're wondering why it took him so long to say this out loud, Shatner himself offers the answer: pride. "I didn't want people to know how afraid I was," he admitted. "I thought it would make me weak, but weakness is the truth of life, and maybe finally I can admit that." That is the truth William Shatner has finally revealed. Not a scandal, not a behind-the-scenes feud, but something far more human. That the man who played Captain Kirk, fearless leader of the Enterprise, was just as vulnerable as the rest of us, and that's when everything changed. When Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan premiered in 1982, it became an instant triumph. Critics hailed it as the return of the franchise. Fans wept openly at Spock's death. And William Shatner, though smiling for cameras and interviews, carried a private mixture of relief and exhaustion. The film had not only saved Star Trek, it had saved him. But what lingered afterward was not just success, but the quiet weight of everything he had endured to reach it. For the decades that followed, Wrath of Khan cast a long shadow. Every new Star Trek film was measured against it. Some came close, others fell short, but none quite captured the same blend of intimacy and grandeur. Shatner reprised Kirk in 4 more films, each time facing new challenges, new scripts, and new negotiations. Yet it was always Wrath of Khan that fans returned to, the benchmark by which his legacy was judged. And here's the irony. For years, Shatner himself avoided talking about its deeper meaning. He gave the standard stories, the charming anecdotes, the light-hearted jokes. But privately, he carried the memory of that fear, the fear of irrelevance, the fear of being eclipsed, the fear of death that had haunted him during the film's production. Only in his 90s did he finally admit it aloud, and in doing so, he reframed not only the movie, but also his own place in cultural history. Because what fans loved about Wrath of Khan wasn't just its villain or its space battles. It was the humanity. It was seeing Kirk wrestle with aging, failure, and loss. It was realizing that even heroes are mortal. And the reason that rang so true was simple. William Shatner himself was living those very fears. The performance was not a mask, but a mirror. Looking back now, it's almost poetic. Shatner once dreaded being forgotten. Today, at 94, he knows that fear was unfounded. He will forever be remembered as Captain James T. Kirk, the man who boldly went where no one had gone before. But what he wants people to remember even more is that behind that legend was a man who struggled, who doubted, who feared the same things we all fear. And that, perhaps, is the real gift of his late-life revelation. It allows us to see the legend not as untouchable, but as profoundly human. The boy from Montreal, who once worried about failure, grew into an actor who carried an entire franchise on his shoulders. The man who feared irrelevance ended up shaping pop culture for generations. And the actor who once hid his vulnerability has finally revealed that it was vulnerability all along that made him great. Now, if you're wondering how this truth reshapes his legacy, the answer lies not just in the past, but in the present. At 94, Shatner is no longer chasing roles, no longer competing for screen time. He has nothing left to prove. Instead, he spends his days reflecting on a career that spanned more than 70 years. He still appears at conventions, still greets fans, still shares stories. But now, his voice carries a different weight. It's the voice of someone who has finally made peace with his own fears. Fans, too, have changed how they see him. For decades, Shatner was both beloved and criticized, admired for his charisma, mocked for his dramatic pauses, scrutinized for his ego. But his honesty, this late in life, has softened perceptions. People no longer see just the bravado. They see the man who dared to admit he was afraid, and in that honesty, he has become even more relatable. The truth about Wrath of Khan, as Shatner finally reveals it, is not about behind-the-scenes feuds or studio politics. It is about the universal struggle to face aging, mortality, and loss. It is about the courage to admit that even those who seem larger than life carry the same doubts as the rest of us. And it is about the strange alchemy of cinema, how one man's fear became a story that comforted millions. When you watch Wrath of Khan now, knowing what Shatner has admitted, the film takes on a new depth. Kirk's journey is no longer just a fictional captain wrestling with time. It is William Shatner himself, staring into the mirror of his own mortality. And that makes the movie not just science fiction, but confession. As the credits roll, as Spock's coffin drifts through the stars, as Kirk whispers that he feels young again, you realize the line belongs not only to the character, but to the actor. Shatner was not claiming victory over death. He was discovering that vulnerability could make him immortal. And so the story ends, not with scandal, not with rivalry, but with revelation. At 94, William Shatner has finally shared the truth that Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan, was his reckoning, his mirror, his confession. And in that truth lies a kind of peace. But one question lingers, soft, haunting, unresolved. If the man who played Captain Kirk still wrestled with fear, what does that say about the rest of us? Perhaps the lesson of Wrath of Khan, and of Shatner's truth, is that courage is not the absence of fear, but the act of facing it anyway. And maybe that's what makes him timeless.